March 17th, 1889, St. Brendan's Seminary, County Cork, Ireland. When groundskeeper Thomas McKenna descended the stone steps into the seminary's oldest basement to investigate a persistent dampness seeping through the refectory floor, he expected to find nothing more than a broken drainage pipe. What he discovered instead would expose one of the most disturbing secrets in Irish Catholic history. Behind a false wall in the subellar, concealed for decades beneath the chapel itself, lay a chamber that shouldn't exist. Inside, authorities would find evidence of systematic abuse spanning over 40 years, journals written in Latin, photographs that defied explanation, and the remains of those who had tried to speak out. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined before. We uncover the truth about St. Brendan's Seminary and the horrors that lurk beneath its holy ground. Make sure to subscribe to Hypnotic Histories and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. To understand the full scope of what happened at St. Brendan's Seminary, we must first understand Ireland in the mid-9th century. This was a nation still reeling from the Great Famine of 1845-1852, which had decimated the population and left deep scars across the social fabric. The Catholic Church had emerged from this crisis with unprecedented power, positioning itself as the primary provider of education, healthcare, and moral guidance to a traumatized population. St. Brendan's Seminary stood on a wind-swept hill overlooking Bantry Bay in County Cork. Established in 1824 by Bishop Edmund O'Sullivan, the institution was designed to train young men for priesthood. The seminary's gray limestone walls rose 4 stories high, topped with slate roofs that gleamed black in the frequent Irish rain. Gothic Revival architecture lent the building an imposing presence. Pointed arches, narrow windows, and flying buttresses that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. The seminary could house up to 60 students at any given time. Young men, typically ranging from ages 16 to 25, who had demonstrated both academic aptitude and spiritual devotion. These seminarians came from families across Ireland, often representing the brightest sons of farming. Communities who saw the priesthood as a path to education and respectability in a nation with few opportunities. Father Declan Rohr arrived at St. Brendan's in 1847 as a newly ordained priest appointed to serve as the seminary's spiritual director and professor of theology. Contemporary accounts describe him as a compelling figure, tall and aesthetic with penetrating blue eyes and a voice that commanded attention during sermons. Bishop O'Sullivan praised Father Rohr's unwavering commitment to discipline and the formation of priestly character. The seminary operated with strict routine. Seminarians rose at 5 o'clock for lauds, followed by meditation, mass, breakfast taken in silence, then classes in Latin, theology, philosophy, and church history. Afternoons included manual labor in the seminar's extensive gardens, more study, vespers, dinner, recreation for 1 hour, complain, and lights out at 9 o'clock. This rigid schedule was believed to forge the self-discipline necessary for a life of celibacy and service. But within this ordered world, something had begun to fester. The first hints of trouble came not from the seminarians themselves, but from the surrounding community. In 1851, a local farmer named Patrick Delaney reported to the local constabulary that his son Michael had returned home from the seminary after only 3 months, refusing to speak about his experiences and exhibiting what the farmer described as a fearful disposition, as though haunted by demons. Michael Delaney would never discuss what happened at St. Brendan's. Within a year, he had immigrated to America, joining the flood of Irish leaving their homeland. This was not an isolated incident. Between 1847 and 1889, parish records show that St. Brendan's Seminary had an unusually high attrition rate. Of the approximately 800 young men who entered the institution during those 42 years, fewer than 40% completed their studies and went on to ordination. The majority either requested transfers to other seminaries, left religious life entirely, or simply disappeared from church records altogether. When concerned parents inquired about their sons' departures, Father Rohr provided ready explanations. The young men lacked the necessary vocation. They couldn't withstand the rigors of seminary life. They had been called to different forms of service. These explanations satisfied most families who trusted the church's judgment implicitly. In post-famine Ireland, Questioning a priest's word was nearly unthinkable. The seminary's reputation remained largely intact throughout the 1850s and 1860s. Father Rohr published several well-regarded theological treatises and became known throughout Ireland as an expert on spiritual formation. He was invited to speak at other seminaries and to advise bishops on matters of clerical training. His influence within the Irish church hierarchy grew steadily. Yet there were whispers. In 1863, a seminarian named Brendan Fitzgerald wrote to his sister, describing St. Brendan's as a place where shadows grow long and prayers go unanswered. The letter was the last communication his family received from him. When his parents traveled to the seminary to inquire about their son, Father Rohr informed them that Brendan had suffered a mental collapse and been transferred to a religious asylum in Dublin. The parents never found their son. The asylum had no record of his admission. By the 1870s, the seminary had developed an ominous reputation among some clergy. Father James Walsh, a priest in neighboring County Kerry, wrote in his private diary in 1876, "Young priests who have come from St. Brendan's carry about them a peculiar quality, a brokenness of spirit that seems at odds with their recent formation. When I inquire about their time there, they grow silent or change the subject. Something is amiss in that place, though I cannot say what." The physical structure of St. Brendan's contributed to its isolated atmosphere. The seminary sat 2 miles from the nearest village, accessed by a single winding road that became impassable during heavy rains. The building itself was a maze of corridors, chapels, and chambers accumulated over decades of additions and renovations. The oldest section dated to 1824, but subsequent expansions in 1835, 1852, and 1868 had created a complex architecture of hidden staircases, sealed-off rooms, and forgotten spaces. The basement levels were particularly labyrinthine. The main cellar contained storage rooms for food, wine for mass, and coal for heating. But beneath this level lay older structures, remnants of whatever building or religious community had occupied the site before the seminary. These sub-cellars were rarely visited. They were cold, prone to flooding, and generally considered unsuitable for any purpose. It was in these forgotten depths that Father Rohr had created his secret world. The first incident that should have triggered serious investigation occurred in January 1855. A Yawine seminarian named Cormac O'Brien was found dead in his dormitory room, hanging from a beam. He was 19 years old. Father Rohr reported the death as a suicide, attributing it to the young man's inability to cope with the demands of seminary life. A local physician, Dr. Henry Morton, examined the body and noted in his report, "Bruising inconsistent with simple hanging, particularly about the wrists and ankles." Dr. Morton's concerns were documented in a letter to the coroner, in which he wrote, "I am troubled by certain marks upon the deceased's body that suggest restraint prior to death. I believe a more thorough investigation is warranted." However, Bishop O'Sullivan intervened personally, emphasizing the need to protect the seminary's reputation and spare the O'Brien family additional suffering. The death was officially ruled a suicide. Cormac O'Brien was buried in the seminary's small cemetery, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross. The second incident came 8 years later, in the autumn of 1863. This time, 3 seminarians disappeared within a single month. The official explanation from Father Rohr was that all 3 had abandoned their vocations and left religious life, but their simultaneous departures struck some as suspicious. More troubling was the fact that none of the 3 young men ever returned to their home parishes or contacted their families again. One of these seminarians, Liam Donovan, had written to his mother just weeks before his disappearance. The letter, preserved in family archives, reveals his state of mind. "Dearest mother, I write to you with a heavy heart. There are practices here that I believe to be contrary to the will of God. Father Rohr conducts certain ceremonies in the old chapel that fill me with dread. When I questioned the propriety of these rituals, I was told that my doubts were evidence of spiritual weakness. I am watched constantly now. I fear what may come if I speak further. Pray for me." Mrs. Donovan brought this letter to her parish priest, Father Timothy O'Connor, who contacted the Diocese of Cork. A brief inquiry was conducted, but Father Rohr denied any wrongdoing and suggested that Liam Donovan had been suffering from scrupulosity an obsessive form of religious anxiety. The investigation was closed. 6 weeks later, Liam Donovan vanished. The third escalation occurred in 1871 and involved a seminarian named Seamus Murphy, who managed to escape from St. Brendan's and make his way to the village of Bantry. He appeared at the local police barracks in the early hours of a February morning barefoot and in his night shirt despite the freezing temperatures. Constable William Burke recorded Murphy's statement. He claims to have witnessed unholy practices in the seminary basement. He speaks of a hidden chamber where Father Rohr conducts what he calls inversions of the Mass. The young man is clearly disturbed, shaking violently and exhibiting signs of extreme terror. Before the constabulary could investigate, Father Rohr arrived at the barracks with 2 other priests. They explained that Seamus Murphy had suffered a severe nervous breakdown and required immediate medical attention. A doctor was summoned, not Dr. Morton, who had raised questions in 1855, but a younger physician named Dr. Albert Carey, who had recently arrived in the area. Dr. Carey examined Murphy and declared him unfit to give reliable testimony due to mental instability. Seamus Murphy was returned to St. Brendan's Seminary. According to the official record, he was transferred to a private sanatorium in Dublin 2 weeks later for treatment of his condition. Like Brendan Fitzgerald before him, Murphy disappeared from all records. The sanatorium in question denied ever receiving such a patient. The fourth incident in 1882 finally began to pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding St. Brendan's, though not in the way anyone expected. A newly ordained priest named Father Colum Hayes, who had graduated from the seminary the previous year, committed suicide in his parish rectory in Limerick. Before his death, he left a detailed letter addressed to the Archbishop of Castile. The letter, which would be suppressed for over a century before finally being released to historians in 1995, described systematic abuse at St. Brendan's Seminary. Father Hayes wrote, "What I witnessed and endured in that cursed place has poisoned my soul beyond redemption. Father Rohr created a kingdom of terror beneath the chapel where he conducted rituals that mocked the sacred mysteries of our faith. Those who resisted or threatened to speak out were taken to the chamber. Some returned changed, broken in ways that cannot be described. Others never returned at all. I have tried to live with this knowledge to serve God despite the darkness that clings to me, but I cannot continue. I beg your grace to investigate St. Brendan's before more souls are destroyed." The Archbishop of Castile forwarded this letter to the Bishop of Cork with a request for inquiry, but Bishop O'Sullivan, now elderly and in declining health, was reluctant to pursue an investigation that might scandalize the Church during a period of increasing anti-Catholic sentiment in Britain and Ireland. The letter was filed away. Father Hayes' suicide was attributed to overwork and melancholy. The matter was quietly forgotten. Throughout the 1880s, parents continued to send their sons to St. Brendan's Seminary, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Father Rohr, now in his 60s, remained in complete control of the institution. His reputation as a spiritual master had only grown over the decades. He published his final book, The Crucible of Holiness, in 1887, which was praised throughout Catholic Europe as a profound meditation on the formation of priests. But the foundation of his secret world was beginning to crack. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. March 17, 1889, St. Patrick's Day, while most of Ireland celebrated their patron saint. Thomas McKenna, the 62-year-old groundskeeper at St. Brendan's Seminary, descended into darkness with a lantern in hand. For weeks, McKenna had noticed water damage in a refectory, the dining hall, where seminarians took their meals. Dark stains spread across the ceiling plaster, and the smell of damp stone permeated the room. Father Rohr had instructed him to investigate the basement levels and locate the source of the moisture. McKenna's lantern cast dancing shadows as he navigated the main cellar. He checked the coal stores, the wine racks, the preserved food chambers. Everything appeared normal, but the dampness seemed to be coming from deeper still, from the sub-cellar that he rarely visited. The stone stairs leading down were slick with moisture. McKenna descended carefully, his arthritic knees protesting each step. The sub-cellar was largely empty, containing only broken furniture and obsolete equipment from decades past. But as McKenna examined the walls, searching for the source of the leak, his lantern illuminated something unusual. Behind a pile of rotting wooden crates, the stone wall appeared different. The mortar was newer, lighter in color than the surrounding masonry. McKenna pushed aside the crates and examined the wall more closely. It wasn't solid stone. It was a false wall constructed to blend with the older architecture, but clearly of more recent construction, and it was loose. McKenna pulled at one of the stones. It shifted. He pulled harder, and the stone came free, revealing darkness beyond. A rush of fed air escaped from the opening, causing McKenna to stagger backward. The smell was overwhelming. Decay, moisture, and something else. Something that made his stomach turn. McKenna enlarged the opening enough to peer through with his lantern. What he saw made him drop the light, which shattered on the stone floor, plunging him into darkness. He fled up the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest. He found the current rector, Father Michael Brennan, who had been appointed to assist the aging father. Roar McKenna's words came in gasps. "Father, you must come. There's a chamber behind the wall. Something terrible. We need the police." Father Brennan gathered 2 other priests and returned to the sub-cellar with fresh lanterns. They enlarged the opening in the false wall and entered the hidden chamber. The room was approximately 20-foot square, with a vate ceiling carved from the bedrock. In the center stood an altar, but not a Christian altar. This was something else entirely. The stone surface was stained dark, and carved into it were symbols that Father Brennan recognized from forbidden texts on occult practices. Around the altar were arranged 6 wooden chairs, each equipped with leather straps for binding wrists and ankles, but it was what lined the walls that truly horrified the priests. Shelves contained dozens of leather-bound journals, all written in Father Roar's distinctive hand. The first journal Father Brennan opened was dated 1847, the year Father Roar arrived at St. Brendan's. The entries described experiments in what Roar called the inversion of grace. He wrote of creating rituals that deliberately inverted Catholic sacraments, using seminarians as unwilling participants in ceremonies designed to break their spirits and bind them to his will. One entry from 1852 read, "The process requires absolute isolation and the systematic destruction of the subject's connection to divine mercy. Through repeated inversions of the Mass conducted in the sealed chamber, the subject experiences a spiritual annihilation that leaves him hollow and obedient. 3 subjects have completed the process successfully. 2 did not survive. Their remains have been disposed of in the catacombs." Catacombs. The word filled Father Brennan with dread. Further exploration of the chamber revealed a narrow passage in the rear wall, descending even deeper into the earth. The priests followed this passage and discovered a natural cave system that had been incorporated into the seminary's foundations. Within these caves, they found the skeletal remains of at least 12 individuals, some still wearing fragments of seminary cast 6. Scattered among the bones were personal effects, rosaries, prayer books, letters from home. One skeleton clutched a small notebook in which the deceased had scratched a final message. "My name is Brendan Fitzgerald. If anyone finds this, know that I did not leave willingly. Father Roar is not a man of God. Tell my mother I loved her." May 15th, 1863. Father Brennan ordered the chamber sealed and sent word immediately to the Bishop of Cork and the local constabulary. By evening, the seminary was surrounded by police. Inspector Edward Doyle of the Royal Irish Constabulary took command of the investigation. When confronted, Father Roar initially denied everything, but when shown the journals written in his own hand, his demeanor changed. According to Inspector Doyle's report, the accused displayed no remorse whatsoever. Instead, he claimed his actions were justified as a form of spiritual refinement. He stated that the church had grown weak and sentimental, and that true holiness required the breaking and remaking of the soul through suffering. He referred to his victims as subjects and expressed pride in what he called his great work. The investigation expanded over the following weeks. Authorities interviewed every living seminarian and former seminarian they could locate. Dozens of men came forward with accounts of abuse, both physical and psychological. The pattern was consistent. Father Roar would identify seminarians who showed independent of thought or who questioned his authority. These individuals would be summoned to special spiritual direction sessions that took place at night. They would be taken to the hidden chamber and subjected to hours of psychological torture, sometimes accompanied by physical abuse, all framed as religious discipline. One survivor, Patrick O'Malley, who had left the seminary in 1878, provided detailed testimony. Father Rohr told us that we were participating in a secret tradition of mystical training that dated back to the Desert Fathers. He said the suffering we endure was necessary to purge us of pride and self-will. He conducted inverted masses in that underground chapel, deliberately saying the words backward, breaking the consecrated host, mixing holy water with blood. He said we were witnessing the destruction and recreation of the sacred, and that this would give us power over spiritual forces. Those who resisted were restrained in the chairs. Some sessions lasted all night. Men came out of that chamber changed, if they came out at all. The investigation of St. Brendan's Seminary became one of the most extensive criminal inquiries in Irish history to that date. Inspector Doyle assembled a team of investigators who spent 3 months examining every aspect of the seminary's operations from 1847 to 1889. The most damning evidence came from Father Rohr's journals. Over 42 years, he had meticulously documented his activities, creating what amounted to a complete confession. The journals revealed a systematic program of psychological and spiritual abuse that had affected hundreds of young men. Rohr had developed what he believed was a revolutionary method of priestly formation based on breaking down the seminarian's existing personality and rebuilding it according to his own design. His methods escalated over time. In the early years, the abuse was primarily psychological isolation, sleep deprivation, and exposure to deliberately corrupted religious rituals designed to create cognitive dissonance and spiritual confusion. But by the 1860s, Rohr had begun to include physical torture, claiming that the body and soul must be broken simultaneously for the process to be effective. The journals also revealed the fate of those who had disappeared. At least 17 young men had died as a result of Rohr's treatments, some from physical injuries sustained during sessions in the chamber, others from suicide in the immediate aftermath, and a few from what were clinically described as spiritual collapse leading to vital shutdown. These victims were buried in the cave system beneath the seminary. Their families told lies about their departures. The physical evidence recovered from the chamber included instruments of restraint, implements that had been used to inflict pain, and hundreds of photographs. These photographs, taken between 1870 and 1889 after photography, became more accessible documented the sessions in the chamber. They showed young men in various stages of physical and psychological breakdown, their faces captured in moments of terror, pain, and despair. Perhaps most disturbing were the lists Rohr had maintained of seminarians categorized by their malleability. He had developed a taxonomy of personalities, identifying which types of young men were most susceptible to his methods and which were likely to resist. Those identified as high risk for resistance often became targets for the most severe treatments. The legal proceedings against Father Declan Rohr began in September 1889 at the Cork County Assizes. He was charged with 17 counts of murder, numerous counts of assault, false imprisonment, and desecration of religious articles. The trial attracted international attention, with reporters from across Europe and America converging on Cork to cover what newspapers called the seminary horror. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor James McCarthy, presented overwhelming evidence. Survivor testimony was compelling and consistent. The physical evidence in the chamber was undeniable. The journals provided a complete record of crimes spanning 4 decades, but the trial was complicated by the involvement of the Catholic Church. The Diocese of Cork initially attempted to have the case heard in ecclesiastical court rather than civil court, arguing that crimes committed by a priest in the exercise of his duties fell under church jurisdiction. This motion was denied, but it delayed proceedings and created tensions between church and state authorities. Several senior church officials were called to testify about their knowledge of complaints against Father Rohr over the years. Bishop O.S. Sullivan, now 78 and in failing health, was questioned about his handling of the 1855 suicide, the 1863 disappearances, the 1871 escape of Seamus Murphy, and the 1882 letter from Father Hayes. His testimony revealed a pattern of willful ignorance and institutional protection that scandalized public opinion. Under cross-examination, Bishop O'Sullivan admitted, "I chose to believe Father Rohr's explanations because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The thought that such evil could exist within our seminary under the roof of God's house seemed impossible. I now understand that my failure to investigate properly allowed this horror to continue. I will carry this burden to my grave." Father Rohr's defense attorney, Bartholomew Quinn, attempted to argue that his client was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions. A panel of alienists, the term for psychiatrists in that era, examined Rohr extensively. They concluded that while his beliefs were aberrant and his actions monstrous, he understood the nature of what he was doing and the difference between right and wrong. He was legally sane. The trial lasted 6 weeks. On November 12, 1889, after only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Father Declan Rohr was sentenced to death by hanging. In a statement from the bench, Justice Robert Lawson said, "You have betrayed every trust placed in you. You have used the authority of the church and the vulnerability of young men to create a kingdom of suffering. You have corrupted sacred things and destroyed innocent lives. The law provides only one punishment, adequate to your crimes." Father Rohr showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. According to witnesses, he smiled slightly and nodded as if receiving confirmation of something he had long expected. While awaiting execution, Rohr received numerous visitors, including several psychologists and church officials who hoped to understand his motivations. To a visiting priest, Father Thomas Muller, Rohr explained his philosophy. "The church teaches that suffering purifies the soul. I merely took this principle to its logical conclusion. The seminarians under my care were refined through fire like gold in a crucible. Some could not withstand the heat and were destroyed. But those who survived emerged stronger, more obedient, more pure. I created true servants of God by breaking them free from the weakness of mercy and compassion." When Father Malahi asked about the inverted masses and occult symbols, Rohr replied, "To truly understand the light, one must experience the depths of darkness. I showed them what damnation feels like, so that they might properly appreciate salvation. The inversions were pedagogical tools, nothing more." Father Declan Rohr was hanged at Cork County Jail on January 15, 1890 at dawn. His last words were reportedly, "I regret nothing. My work will be understood in time." St. Brendan Seminary was permanently closed by order of the Diocese of Cork in March 1890. The building stood empty for several years before being demolished in 1895. Today, only the foundation stones remain, visible in a field overlooking Bantry Bay. The site is unmarked, though locals still refer to the area as Rohr's Folly. The victims' remains recovered from the cave system were identified where possible and returned to their families for proper burial. Those who could not be identified were interred in a special section of the Cork City Cemetery with a monument that reads, "Simply in memory of the lost sons of Ireland. May light perpetual shine upon them." The St. Brendan Seminary case sent shock waves through the Catholic Church in Ireland and beyond. The scandal could not be contained or minimized. The evidence was too extensive, the crimes too numerous, and public outrage too intense. In the immediate aftermath, the Vatican launched an investigation into seminary operations throughout Ireland. Pope Leo III issued a papal decree in 1891, requiring all seminaries to undergo regular inspections by committees that included both church officials and lay observers. This was one of the first times the church had accepted external oversight of its educational institutions. The case also prompted changes in Irish civil law. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1891 created new provisions for investigating abuse within religious institutions and removed certain legal privileges that had previously protected clergy from prosecution. The act established that crimes committed under the guise of religious authority would be treated as aggravating factors rather than mitigating ones. Psychologically, the St. Brendan's case contributed to emerging discussions about trauma and its long-term effects. Several survivors of Rohr's abuse spent years in treatment, unable to function normally in society. Their experiences helped early. Psychologists understand what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder and complex trauma resulting from sustained psychological abuse. The case also exposed the dangers of unchecked authority within hierarchical institutions. Father Rohr had operated with virtual impunity for over 4 decades because his victims were powerless. His superiors were unwilling to investigate, and the culture of deference to clerical authority prevented effective oversight. This pattern would unfortunately be repeated in countless other cases of institutional abuse throughout the 20th century. Historians have identified at least 3 other cases of serious abuse in Irish seminaries during the same period, though none approached the scale or systematic nature of St. Brendan's. These cases only came to light after the Rohr trial emboldened victims to come forward. The Daces of Dublin investigated allegations at St. Columba's Seminary in 1891, finding evidence of physical abuse, though nothing comparable to Rohr's chamber horrors. Several priests were quietly removed from teaching positions. The scandal also had a complex effect on Irish Catholicism. While some used the case to attack the church, many Irish Catholics saw it as an aberration, one evil man whose crimes did not reflect the institution as a whole. This interpretation allowed the church to maintain much of its authority in Ireland, though its moral standing had been damaged. Some survivors of St. Brendan's went on to become advocates for institutional reform. Patrick O'Malley, whose testimony was crucial at trial, dedicated his life to supporting other victims of clerical abuse. He founded the Irish Association for Protection of Children in Religious Education in 1895, one of the first organizations of its kind. His work helped establish protocols for reporting and investigating abuse in religious settings. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Several survivors, including those who provided testimony at trial, struggled with their faith for the rest of their lives. How could they reconcile their belief in a loving God with what they had experienced in God's name? The spiritual injury, in many ways, was Father Rohr's most lasting legacy. A generation of men whose capacity for faith had been systematically destroyed. Medical professionals studying the case noted the physical effects of prolonged psychological torture. Survivors exhibited symptoms including chronic insomnia, anxiety disorders, difficulty with intimate relationships, and what contemporary physicians called nervous exhaustion. These observations contributed to the growing understanding that psychological trauma could manifest in physical symptoms, a concept that would later become central to psychiatric medicine. The case also raised troubling questions about the nature of evil itself. Was Father Rohr insane, as his defense attorney argued, or was he something more disturbing, a rational, intelligent man who had convinced himself that cruelty was virtue? The alienists who examined him were disturbed by his coherence and logical consistency.